My mother forgot to end the call, and in less than 30 seconds, everything I believed about my family collapsed. I stood frozen in my empty kitchen, my phone still pressed against my ear. I had called to remind her about a doctor's appointment, but instead I heard her laughing with my older brother. "She's a burden," she said without hesitation. I wish she'd never been born. The room around me felt strangely silent. The kettle whistled on the stove, but I couldn't move. My hands trembled so badly that I nearly dropped the phone. My brother didn't defend me. He laughed and answered, "At least she keeps paying the mortgage." Neither of them realized the call was still connected. For years, I had quietly covered the house payments, property taxes, and repairs while pretending it didn't matter that I was treated like an unwanted guest in the home I was saving. I never argued. I never cried in front of them. As their voices drifted through the speaker, something inside me changed forever. They believed I would always stay, always sacrifice, and always forgive. They had no idea that this accidental phone call had just become the beginning of the quietest revenge of my life. I was 34 years old when that phone call finally forced me to see the truth. I had spent years avoiding. My father had passed away nearly a decade earlier, leaving behind a modest house and a mountain of unpaid bills. My mother insisted she couldn't manage everything alone, and my older brother always had a reason why he couldn't help. Without making a speech or asking for praise, I quietly stepped in. I worked long hours as an accountant, skipped vacations, drove the same aging car for years, and turned down opportunities to buy a home of my own. Every extra dollar went toward keeping my childhood house standing. The mortgage was paid on time because of me. The roof was repaired because of me. When the furnace failed in winter, I covered the cost without hesitation. Yet somehow I was never treated like family. I was treated like convenience. If dinner was cooked, my brother was thanked for being there. If groceries appeared in the kitchen, my mother acted as though they had magically arrived. My name was rarely mentioned unless another payment was due or another problem needed solving. I convinced myself that love didn't always sound grateful. I told myself that one day my mother would notice the sacrifices I had made. Every birthday passed with a generic card, while my brother received expensive gifts despite contributing almost nothing. I smiled through every disappointment because I believed keeping the family together mattered more than keeping score. Friends often asked why I never moved out or started living for myself. I always defended my family, saying they needed me more than I needed freedom. Looking back, I realized I wasn't protecting them. I was protecting the illusion that they loved me the way I loved them. The forgotten phone call didn't create the betrayal. It simply stripped away the last excuse. I had been hiding behind and exposed a painful truth I could no longer ignore. After that phone call, I stopped making excuses for the things I had always ignored. Once the illusion was gone, every interaction felt different, as if someone had adjusted the lighting on a familiar stage and exposed what had been hiding in plain sight. The following Sunday, I came over with bags of groceries, just as I had done for years. My mother barely looked up from the television when I set them on the kitchen counter. She simply nodded toward the refrigerator and said, "Put everything away before you leave." Not a thank you, not even a smile. A few minutes later, my brother walked through the front door carrying nothing but his car keys. My mother's face brightened instantly. "There's my favorite son," she said warmly. She asked if he was hungry before asking how I had been. He shrugged, dropped onto the couch, and accepted compliments for always checking in on the family. I stood in the kitchen, quietly unpacking the groceries I had paid for, listening to praise that belonged to someone else. The pattern repeated itself every week. Whenever a bill arrived, it somehow found its way into my hands. Whenever something expensive broke, my mother would sigh dramatically before saying, "I don't know what we'd do without you." It sounded like gratitude at first, but I eventually realized it was expectation. She wasn't thanking me. She was reminding me of the role she believed I could never leave. Even relatives played along without realizing it. At family dinners, my brother told stories about his busy schedule while everyone admired his ambition. No one asked why I looked exhausted after working late every night. No one noticed that. I quietly paid the restaurant bill before slipping the receipt into my pocket. I spoke less with every visit. I observed more. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like a place where my kindness had become invisible, and where my silence was mistaken for weakness. They believed I would continue carrying their lives forever. I had already decided otherwise. The moment I finally decided to stop wasn't loud or dramatic. No one screamed. No doors slammed. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while I was sorting through my monthly bank statements. For the first time in years, I added up every mortgage payment, every repair invoice, every tax bill, and every transfer I had made for the house. The total stared back at me from the calculator, and I sat there in complete silence. I had spent enough to build a future for myself. Instead, I had spent it trying to earn love that was never being offered. I opened the folder where my father had kept the house documents. As I carefully read through the paperwork, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. The property had legally become mine after the estate was settled years earlier. My mother had always lived there, but the ownership had been transferred to me because I had accepted responsibility for the remaining debt and continued making every payment. For years, I had acted like a guest in a house that was legally my own. That realization changed everything. I wasn't trapped. I was choosing to stay trapped. I closed the folder, leaned back in my chair, and replayed my mother's words from the forgotten phone call. "She's a burden. I wish she'd never been born." For the first time, those words no longer made me feel hurt. They made me feel clear. I understood that no conversation would fix this. No apology would erase years of quiet disrespect. They didn't need another chance to explain themselves. I didn't need another chance to prove my worth. I called a real estate agent the next morning. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't confront my brother. I simply gathered the necessary documents, signed the paperwork, and let the process begin. If they believed I would spend the rest of my life carrying a home where I was never truly wanted, they were about to discover how wrong they had been. Planning, strategic action, first person marred 300 words. I treated the next few weeks the way I handled every difficult situation at work, with patience, careful planning, and emotion kept firmly out of the process. As an accountant, I understood the importance of documentation. Feelings could be argued with, but paperwork could not. Before making a single move, I reviewed every mortgage statement, tax receipt, insurance payment, and repair invoice I had kept over the years. Every record confirmed the same truth. The house belonged to me, and every financial obligation had been met through my efforts. I met with a real estate attorney to make sure there were no surprises. He reviewed the ownership documents, explained my legal rights, and confirmed that everything had been transferred properly years earlier. There were no hidden claims and no restrictions preventing a sale. Hearing those words didn't make me feel victorious. They simply gave me certainty. Next, I contacted a real estate agent with a reputation for discretion. I explained that I wanted the property listed quietly and requested that all communication come directly to me. We scheduled photographs while my mother and brother were out for the afternoon, and I removed every personal item that still meant something to me. I rented a small apartment in another state, close to a branch office where my company had recently offered me a transfer. It wasn't a luxurious place, but it represented something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. I continued visiting my mother exactly as before. I brought groceries, paid the final utility bills, and smiled through ordinary conversations. Nothing about my routine changed, and that was intentional. They never questioned why I seemed so calm, because they had mistaken my silence for surrender. Meanwhile, offers began arriving. When I accepted one, I signed the contract with a steady hand. There was no anger left inside me, only relief. For years, I had quietly carried a family that saw me as a burden. Now, just as quietly, I was putting down the weight for good. Closing day arrived with surprising calm. I signed the final documents in a quiet conference room, accepted the transfer confirmation, and handed over the keys. There was no celebration, no dramatic speech, and no last-minute hesitation. By sunset, I was already driving toward my new apartment in another state with everything that truly belonged to me packed into my car. I left my mother a short letter on the kitchen table. The house has been sold. The sale was legal and final. I've paid every bill I could for years, but I can no longer build my life around people who only value what I provide. I hope you both find the future you chose. I'm choosing mine. I turned off my phone before crossing the state line. The next morning, I switched it back on. 67 missed calls. My mother had called first, then my brother, then unfamiliar numbers belonging to relatives who had never once asked how I was doing until they suddenly needed something from me. There were voicemails filled with confusion at first, then disbelief, then anger, finally in desperation. The new owners had arrived exactly as scheduled. They had every legal document, every signed contract, and every right to take possession of their new home. My mother and brother could argue with reality, but they couldn't argue with ownership. I listened to one voicemail from my mother. Her voice shook as she begged me to answer. For years, I had begged silently for kindness, respect, and a place in my own family. Those requests had been ignored just as easily. I deleted the message without replying. Then I placed my phone on the table beside the window of my new apartment and watched the evening sun disappear behind unfamiliar buildings. For the first time in years, the silence around me didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, they were finally living with the consequences of the choices they had made long before I ever made mine. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected, but the silence carried a different weight. My phone stopped ringing every hour. The desperate voicemails became occasional text messages, then long emails from relatives who suddenly wanted to hear my side of the story. Apparently, my mother had told everyone that I had abandoned her without warning. She forgot to mention the years I had paid the mortgage, covered the repairs, and kept the house standing while everyone else assumed someone else was taking care of it. The truth didn't stay hidden for long. When a few relatives asked questions, I simply sent copies of the payment records and ownership documents. I didn't add insults or accusations. The facts spoke more clearly than anger ever could. Some relatives apologized for never noticing what had really been happening. Others stayed silent, perhaps embarrassed that they had judged me before knowing the full story. My brother never apologized. His messages shifted from blaming me to asking if there was any way to fix this. I never answered. For the first time in my life, I realized that protecting my peace didn't require anyone else's permission. My new apartment slowly began to feel like home. I bought furniture I actually liked, cooked meals without feeling obligated to feed people who barely acknowledged me, and spent weekends exploring my new city instead of solving someone else's problems. The money I once poured into a house filled with resentment finally became an investment in my own future. Looking back, I understand that the greatest consequence wasn't that my mother lost the house. It was that she lost the one person who had quietly held her world together. People often believe betrayal begins with one terrible moment. It rarely does. It begins with small acts of disrespect repeated so often that they become normal. That's why this story matters. The people who value you only when you are useful don't lose you because you change. They lose you the moment you finally realize your own worth. A year has passed since I drove away from the only house I ever called home. Sometimes people ask if I regret selling it. I always answer the same way. I don't regret leaving the house. I regret staying as long as I did. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were lonely evenings in my new apartment and quiet holidays that reminded me of everything I had lost. Healing wasn't a single decision. It was a series of small choices. Choosing to spend money on my own future instead of someone else's expectations. Choosing to answer only the calls that brought peace instead of guilt. Choosing to believe that my worth had never depended on how much I could sacrifice. Work became more rewarding because I finally had the freedom to pursue promotions I had ignored for years. I made new friends who appreciated my company rather than my generosity. Slowly, I built a life where kindness was returned instead of quietly consumed. Months after the sale, my mother sent one final letter. It wasn't an apology. It was another attempt to convince me that family should forgive family. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and stored it in a drawer without responding. Forgiveness, I realized, didn't always require reopening a door that had nearly destroyed you. Sometimes it simply meant letting go of the anger while refusing to return to the place where it was created. The forgotten phone call had shattered my heart, but it had also opened my eyes. For years, I believed love meant enduring endless sacrifice. Now I understand that real love never asks someone to disappear so others can remain comfortable. Looking back, I no longer see myself as the daughter who was called a burden. I see the woman who finally chose herself. And in the end, my quietest decision became the loudest lesson they would ever learn. The people who mistake your silence for weakness are always shocked the day your silence becomes goodbye.